Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 110, Blank-Faced Buster.
Yeah, where we talk about the silent film star of your choosing based on the poll and some options. We've worked through quite a number of these episodes now, but this time around, y'all chose Buster Keaton, and it was a close one. But I am very excited to finally talk about Buster Keaton on the podcast.
Absolutely. And so after we talked about Charlie Chaplin back in season 1, we're 2/3 of the way through what's kind of known as the three great clowns of the silent film era. So we will get to Harold Lloyd hopefully sooner rather than later on the podcast. But for now, let's talk about who this Buster Keaton guy really was. He was born in 1895 in Kansas, and he was actually born as Joseph Frank Keaton. But there's a story that has a couple slight variations about how he got the nickname Buster. Apparently it happened very early, like when he was months old. There's a story where he fell down some stairs and just kind of shook it off and got up and, was fine. And so family friend was like, wow, he's a regular Buster. And so then his dad just started calling him Buster, and now everyone in the world does too.
That's a fitting story considering where he ends up.
Yeah, no kidding. And his whole family was performers. It was a vaudeville family, and I think we've talked about vaudeville on the show before, but basically it was an old variety show. You would go to the theater and not necessarily see a play, but you would see a bunch of acts. It could be musical acts or comedy acts or like
typically fairly lowbrow.
Yeah, it's kind of like America's Got Talent is probably the closest thing I can compare it to now, where you just like someone has something they can do, and they just go put on a show.
A lot of flashy stuff, a lot of simple stuff, a lot of body stuff, exaggerated performances. A lot of early film comedy has its roots in vaudeville.
Yeah, very much so. And so for Buster Keaton's family, their show was called The Three Keatons. And their show basically consisted of Keaton's mom playing an instrument and providing the music, while Keaton's dad would pick him up and throw him around the stage, throw him into walls. Like, he's 3 years old at this point, by the way, and just kind of like, throw him into the orchestra pit and do all these kind of like just funny physical gags, to the point that it actually kind of got him a couple of child abuse allegations, but they did do meticulous training. It was, all done in a spirit of performance. And so Buster Keaton learned very early on how to do trick falls and how to fall properly without injuring himself. He actually rarely injured himself.
You're a regular Buster, kid.
Yeah, he is. He's literally a regular Buster. And the show got so popular that it eventually changed its name to The Little Boy Who Can't Be Damaged, because he was so good at just falling around the stage and getting thrown around, and just kind of,
I also like how clunky that name is.
I know, it's really not not catchy, but it's also kind of known as one of the most dangerous acts ever done in vaudeville, which is crazy. But Keaton loved it. Like, this was not a thing where, his dad is venting on him. This is all part of a performance, and Keaton was very much part of that performance. But he noticed that if he got too into it and he started laughing while he was being thrown around, there would be less laughs from the audience. And so that eventually evolved into his famous deadpan expression, where he just kind of took the falls and, had this kind of incredulous what just happened kind of look on his face. And that carried throughout his entire career as one of the things he's most well known for. Eventually, he met, this is many years later, he met Fatty Arbuckle in 1917, and they quickly became good friends and started working together. Keaton would direct a little bit. He would come up with gags for him. He would act in Arbuckle's films. And then he was so good at all that he was eventually given the freedom to direct his first two-reeler, which is a short film, basically 20 minutes long, called 1 Week. We actually just talked about 1 week recently.
It's
on
been
our
1 week since you looked at me.
Alex's trigger word.
Dropped your head to the side and said, I'm sorry.
we just talked about this on our bonus podcast because that came out 100 years ago. So you can check out our Patreon if you would like to hear about that.
Both the short film and the song.
Yeah, both of those. So then he eventually moved on to doing feature films. The General is generally considered his masterpiece. And in 1928, he signed with MGM, and that he would often describe as the worst decision of his career because this was heavy into the studio system, and the studio became basically the creative control for him. He was so used to being able to do, whatever he wanted on his films and have a lot of control over the way that the gags came off and how the story went and all that kind of stuff that when he had to report to the studio and higher ups and that kind of thing, he got really demoralized by that. And then around the same time, sound came along. And so then the studios were making films, and the process of in the early days of making those sound films included shooting every scene 3 times in 3 different languages. So they would do English, Spanish, and German, at least, I think. And for the languages that they didn't know, they had to learn them phonetically and just like repeat them on screen immediately after they learned how the words go. And Keaton hated doing it this way. And so he just got like really depressed about it and eventually got fired from MGM. And his career really kind of started to flounder, really, as far as like big things that he was doing. But he did continue to make appearances. He made some cameos in film and television in some big films, including Sunset Boulevard, In the Good Old Summertime with Judy Garland, Limelight with Charlie Chaplin, the only time Keaton and Chaplin showed up in the same film together. And he was even on The Twilight Zone, because I always got to plug my Twilight Zone. And then eventually he passed away in 1966. But his legacy lives on, and there's so much influence from Keaton that we see in, comedy, in filmmaking, in so much aspects of cinema today that his contribution is just gigantic.
Certainly. And he's from that era of creative freedom pre-studio system where the people with the talent were the people in charge. Which has its ups and downs, but it was the system that produces movies like these, which are very unique, very signature, and the entire piece definitely oozes his persona and his style, which it's very easy to kind of, and it's also right to lump him and Chaplin and Lloyd into the same era and kind of the same category. But he also has his own very unique brand of humor that's different from Chaplin's. And we'll explore that as well today. But specifically, we're going to be talking about 3 movies of his, the first of which, all feature length. The first of which is Sherlock Jr. from 1924, which is directed by Buster Keaton and is very meta. The second is The General from 1926, which is directed both by Buster Keaton and Clyde Bruckman. It's based on William Pittenger's memoir from the Civil War called The Great Locomotive Chase. And finally, we'll be talking about The Cameraman from 1928, which is also very meta, which was directed by Buster Keaton, uncredited, and Edward Sedgwick. This is the first film he made after signing with MGM, but before his loss of faith in the system and his loss of complete creative freedom.
Yeah, right. So, I guess let's just get into it. Jason, why don't you set up Sherlock Jr. for us?
Sherlock Jr. from 1924. A movie theater projectionist played by Keaton vies for the affections of a beautiful girl with his local rival, the Sheik. After the Sheik steals and then frames the projectionist for stealing a watch from the girl's family, the projectionist, who's been studying to be a detective, sets out to discover the truth of who's behind the watch theft. So he falls asleep during a film about the theft of a pearl necklace and dreams he enters the movie as the detective, Sherlock Jr., to solve the crime and save the day. Meanwhile, the girl he loves in the real world does some detective work of her own.
All right, Alex, some of these is going to be like just trying not to go through a list of every single gag in the movie because they're just so good. And sometimes the films do get a little vignette-y where scenes feel like they're built to deliver a gag or set up a string of gags or something along those lines, but they all do have a structure. And
Yeah.
the daydream structure of this is actually something that carries on into a lot of movies and TV these days.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same kind of, in a way, it's the same structure of like It's a Wonderful Life, but with a twist that we've seen elsewhere before. And it is fair because this is in that era where you're expanding to the feature film, but you haven't really, the plot structure of the feature film isn't 100% established yet. Like the telling an entire story arc in an hour and a half to 2 hours isn't quite firmed up yet. It's begun, but it hasn't become as solid as it will in the next few decades. Probably not until the 40s will you see the classic Hollywood structure of a film really firm up. And keep in mind that what the feature-length movie is based off of is probably the play, but most plays are much longer than that, including an intermission
Especially
in
at this
between.
point, all three of these movies are like under an hour and a half.
Yeah, so this is kind of like an unexplored area of storytelling that's going here. And it's based around one guy being really funny. And what can we do with that? And in a way, and maybe it's because it's at the start of the century, or maybe because it's exploring a new format. There's something about Buster Keaton movies that always remind me a little bit of like early YouTube skits. Like we've got some people who are funny and they're experimenting with a new format. And it's based entirely around the personality of one or a few people. And in this case, it's Buster Keaton being funny.
That experimentation thing is important too. And I think that like one of the YouTubers that I was thinking of, because I kind of, was along the same lines with you on that. And I kept thinking of like Zach King, the guy who does a bunch of perspective magic tricks, like in really quick snippets, because Keaton does a lot of that stuff. They're called like impossible gags, which he would eventually kind of move away from because he wanted the gags to be more based in realism. But there are things like in Sherlock Jr. when he jumps through the suitcase, there's some kind of a trapdoor thing happening, and he jumps through the suitcase that the person is holding up and disappears into it.
And he vanishes into the dress, and he does a quick costume change that way.
Yeah, and it's really impressive, but it's something that you're like, whoa, wait a second, how did he do that? And so you're thinking about the gag more than what's going on in the story at that moment. But they're still really impressive.
Yeah, I love the impossible gags in this movie, specifically the one of, well, I guess it wouldn't be an impossible gag, would it? Where he walks into the movie screen?
Yeah, I think so, because in the logic of the movie, he walked into another movie.
Yeah.
So the trick itself isn't really magic, but in terms of like story logic, it is.
Yeah, we know how they did it too, which is actually quite clever the way they set it up. It's literally just a frame around the stage, so it looks like he walks into it. But
with a very flat set and all deep focus.
Before they get into, he walks into the shot, they show clips of the actual screen playing. With close-ups and stuff, so you establish it is a movie, and then they go to the wide, which is where he enters in. And then when you get deep into the movie, you're moving beyond the stage, which is quite clever. It's also quite meta, which I quite enjoy, because he's playing on the idea of the audience watching the movie and dreaming about being in the movie. Also, audience reactions to the movie. And I think as far as the meta angle goes, there's actually some important or interesting or significant commentary in this movie at the very end, once he gets everything's been resolved and he's back with his girl again, everything's been fixed, but he's in the projection room and he wants to make a move, but he has no idea how to do it, and he's like looking at the screen. He's like, okay, he's copying what he sees on screen, and that's actually kind of honest. Like, that's a big way that for the past century, kids have learned romance from in a big way, is seeing it on screen and copying what they see there. Sometimes for better and sometimes for worse.
And I wonder how much that had really been established at this point, depending on, what kinds of movies, and the fact that maybe not TV wasn't, or I guess film may not have been quite as ubiquitous as it would become in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So it's almost more prescient than like a direct commentary on what's going on. But it is like it's so accurate and timeless, because I mean that's something that, as long as film and television are the primary mediums for our entertainment, then they're also going to be primary mediums for impression and for replication and that kind of thing.
Learning how social laundries work. I mean, how many times do you think about, is that what I've seen people do? And you include in that list things you've seen in a movie. Right. And it's so easy
Hence
to go like,
phrase,
yeah, that's
that only happens
behavior.
in movies.
Yeah. It's so easy to go, oh, that's normal behavior when you've only seen it in movies. And I'll tell you what, if you've seen it in recent movies, anything made in the last 2 decades, it's probably not normal behavior. But unless it's made by like Baumbach. But
yeah, or it's like verite documentary.
But yes, it is a significant piece of meta commentary. That's really just a gag, but I think it's significant for more than just its social interest. I think it shows how well Buster Keaton understands what makes movies tick. And that kind of plays in his character as well. Because his character, he tries to be bold, but he's really kind of, he's way weaker than all the other men in his films. He's not as
and he's so short. Like his
brash.
stature gets hammered home, especially in this one, a little bit in the other two. But when he's sizing up everyone. Yeah, and he's like staring up at his face and trying to, intimidate him. As far as what's rule number 1? Search your man, which honestly, search everybody. And searching everybody is like, sounds like a really obvious thing, but I thought about it and I was like, they never do that in movies. Like when there's some kind of a mystery, they never just straight up search everyone who was there right at the moment. Like that seems so simple, so obvious.
That would end it in the plot too fast. In here, the rule structure, the fact that he's reading that book at the beginning is really clever. Because one, it makes the screen titles, the inner titles, way more interesting because we're looking at a diegetic piece of information rather than just something interjected. And two, it gives him a nice way to move the plot along. You've run a gag out.
Yeah.
Move on to the next rule.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I also want to kind of go back because we had mentioned the love interest a little earlier, and her character is really interesting because she ends up being the hero that he dreams about being, which is such a fascinating kind of twist on the whole thing. Because
I love that she's getting stuff done while he's like off
daydreaming about being the hero, which honestly, when he's daydreaming about being Sherlock Jr. or whatever, it almost turns more into like a Bond movie where the bad guys have like exploding pool balls and poison and like booby traps.
It gets really extreme.
Yeah, it's so like over the top in a way that Bond movies and adventure movies and spy movies will become in the decades to follow, almost more unironically than anything, which makes this even more of a prescient kind of a commentary.
I like that it's kind of a play on the like dreamlike quality of silent films.
A film as a medium, yeah.
A film as a medium, but especially silent films. I think a lot of people, when you look at a lot of the scholarship, a lot of it goes back to that point over and over again, with that silent films felt much more dreamlike than sound films because they were less like reality. But one of the things that I really like about Buster Keaton, and the thing you brought up about the woman saving the day, is this is one of the big differences in his persona from, say, like Charlie Chaplin, which most of you are very familiar with. The tramp character is always a little more clever than everybody else on screen. Yeah, he's the Bugs Bunny. Buster Keaton's character is just earnest. And he tries really hard.
Yeah, he's trying.
He tries really hard, but he typically screws it up. And it's typically someone else who comes in and saves the day. But he's earned whatever help he's gotten from being so honest and genuine and having the blank face. It would almost be as if he smiled and was like thoroughly enjoying the adventure, as if he hadn't earned it, hadn't earned that help, hadn't earned that ending. But with him being as genuine and heartfelt as a person, as no nonsense as he is, that you understand that he really wants this thing. He's really earned this thing. He's earned the help. And I think, in at least this in the Cameraman, it's the woman who saves the day. Maybe a woman and the monkey in the Cameraman. But
yeah, no, the monkey gets all the credit in the Cameraman.
Yeah, but that was the person he's after. And so the woman resolving the plot is nice, but really he's gotten what he's wanted. He's gotten his own goal. He's completed his own arc through being genuine and being heartfelt.
Mm-hmm.
And that heartfeltness, winning his own arc, is what causes his love interest to come through in the end and resolve the plot of the film for him. So it doesn't feel unearned. It actually just feels a little humble, actually, which is surprisingly nice for silent era comedians.
Yeah, and it provides a nice contrast, because I think in all three of these, he's always kind of the second choice suitor. You know, there's always a bigger, stronger guy who has more impressive credentials, or who's a better soldier or whatever. And so just his sheer persistence and genuineness is what has to prove him to the love interest, which is what gives him the leg up on just the sheer brawn of everyone else, which is also what makes him more relatable, because we all think of ourselves as the underdog.
Yeah, no, nobody is the big bad in their own story.
Yeah, right.
Everyone feels a little like life is unfair to them, which can be the case. But it is especially the case in here. And the fact that he just like never gives up is nice. Anyway, the fact is that he's just very enduring, I think, is what we're trying to get at. He is a character who's very easy to feel very sympathetic with, and both enjoy his escapades and find humor in how little he's enjoying them, which goes back to what you said about how he noticed how when he smiled more, the audience smiled less. Just the deadpanness works.
Yeah, and it continues to this day. I mean, you think of comedians like Bill Murray. We've talked about so many sad Bill Murray movies, but sad Bill Murray movies work because bad things happen to him, and he just has this kind of, deadpan face on the whole time. So the other thing is like in this one and the next one, and kind of the Cameraman too, but like these are not just straight action movies. They are using other. I keep wanting to call these things like pre-existing, but I don't know how pre-existing some of this stuff actually is. But there's the mystery genre, and we know how mystery stories work. Obviously, the film is called Sherlock Jr., even though there's not like a huge. It's not like he's homaging the Sherlock stories or anything very specific. It's just kind of Sherlock.
It's like loosely Sherlock. It's just a stand-in for all detectives.
Yeah, it's just like putting a detective cloak on the whole thing, so we kind of get how it flows. But we do have his rules. He's trying to follow that. It's the I think probably today we see this in the type of movies where someone wants to be a cop because they've seen cop shows, and so they're like just trying to follow all the things that they've seen on TV, and he's kind of doing that, but following all the rules that he knows about from his books about detectives and stuff. And again, it's in a dream sequence, so it's all just kind of like fantasy in his head, whereas the girl is doing the actual detective work. And so it's interesting that he's not just, setting up a bunch of falling down gags. He's actually like using pre-existing kind of literary structure that we know about to deliver those gags, and both elements of it work.
Yeah, I actually really like the subplot of the love interest going and solving the case. There's actually like quite a bit of plots to manage in this particular movie, and they're done fairly well. Like he has problems at his job. He's falling asleep. His boss gets mad at him. Everybody's looking for $1 in the pile. He's having problems with his love
the dollar
interest.
gag that goes on for like 10 minutes at the beginning of the movie is great.
Yeah, that's just like a mood setter at like the very beginning of the film before we even get into the plot. That's just tone setting, which actually that isn't something we've talked about a lot on the podcast, but this is a good time to.
Because we're going to see the same thing in the Cameraman.
At the very beginning of a movie or any story in any format, really, you make promises to your audience regarding what tone it's going to have. So if you're in a drama, you set up some dramatic beats early on. Nothing too heavy, but you let them know. That way that the audience doesn't feel like you take a right turn into a completely different movie halfway through. Twists are fine, but you want to state what kind of thing the audience should be prepared for in this film. And in this case, it is comedy of a certain type, and you're also setting up how the extras in the film are going to work, which is a little rude, a little brash, and a little selfish.
And you do character development on Keaton when, he's trying to hold on to this $1 and then he finally decides to give it to the one guy who's like down on his luck. And then, he's like, no, that's not the one I want. And then he finds like a big pile and then Keaton's like, oh, crap.
Yeah, that guy was hilarious. But yeah, it's a good instance of expectation and tone management, which is important in movies, in all storytelling, especially in really brash comedies, because you want to know what kind of humor you're going to be experiencing. So you get to see the deadpan early on. You get to see the how Buster Keaton reacts to things, how the world treats him. He's unlucky. You should not expect him to get lucky breaks in this movie.
Yeah. So yeah, another thing I want to bring up about the gags in this movie is that this shows how meticulous Keaton was in his setups and stuff. So going back to the gag we already talked about where he jumps into the movie screen and then the scene starts changing and he's in the same place and trying to manage whatever new situation he finds himself in. So he's in a house and then he's in the middle of a street and then he's on this rock with waves crashing over him and stuff like that. And so but apparently when they were filming, they had to use really precise measurement tools and they had to measure the position in frame and everything so that he would be exactly in the same position. And it shows just kind of how dedicated he was to pulling off his gags. And again, why if Keaton has an idea in his mind that's going to take, an extra 2 weeks to get it exactly right, once he's under a studio system, that's not going to fly unless it's already been pre-planned. And so, but that gag pays off because that's one of the most impressive gags of him just jump. I mean, the whole setup is literally just for that gag, but it's so meticulously done that it pays off brilliantly. And it's just super impressive, but it shows the dedication that Keaton has to all of his jokes. Yeah,
it's the kind of independent artistry that you're not used to seeing it within the studio system. At least early on, it kind of had to auteurs of all varieties kind of had to learn to adapt to the studio system, and that took a while for it to really come to fruition. You don't see auteurs again until maybe the late 30s, early 40s. And even then in a very different guise than what you're used to in this era where the Mary Pickfords and the Charlie Chaplins and the Buster Keatons had complete control over what they made, which is something very unique, but also something that a company that interested in optimizing the revenue does not tolerate well.
Yeah. And I think the last thing, just to kind of transition us into the next movie, is to talk about the action scene at the end of this movie, where still in the dream sequence, Sherlock Jr. is following or being followed by the bad guys as he runs away. And there's a car chase, there's a shootout, there's
riding on the front of a motorcycle.
Yeah, riding on the front of a motorcycle, which goes in front of a train, and all of these action pieces, again, they go into using other genres for the comedy. And some of the comedy is literally just sheer skill and talent. And that's like what we're going back into is like Buster Keaton himself doing all these things is what you go to the theater for. Like it's his personality, it's his physical prowess. It's like how, so much conversation happens whenever Tom Cruise comes out with a new Mission Impossible movie and, oh my gosh, he actually hung off of that airplane, or he's actually going into space, which I think is the last bit of news that I saw.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God. Okay.
Or whatever Tom Cruise is doing. It's the same kind of deal where Buster Keaton is actually doing all of these things. And if he wasn't, which again, this is just going to keep coming up, when he started getting into the studio system, they made him use stunt doubles. And as Buster Keaton would say, stunt doubles don't get laughs. It's because we didn't go to a theater to see a stunt double do a thing. We went to the theater to see Buster Keaton do a thing. And the fact that Buster Keaton can do the thing and can create a story and craft this whole world in which all of these ridiculous rules and things work, and he's kind of like at the center, the mastermind and the victim of it all at the same time. That is what makes all of these things work so well.
Yeah, no, it's part of the thrill. It's part of the spectacle. He does it, so you go see it, which is advertising better than you could even hope for.
And those gags through danger get amplified even more in The General.
Dun, dun, dun. Jason,
are you ready to move on? All right, yeah, set it up.
The General from 1926. Railroad engineer Johnny Gray has two great loves in his life, his fiancée Annabelle and his train, the General. When the Civil War breaks out, he can't join the Confederate Army because of his status as an essential worker, and Annabelle quickly breaks up with him because of his inability to serve in the war. A year later, when his father is injured in the fighting, Annabelle starts off on a train to the front line, but is kidnapped by Northern troops. When Johnny finds out, he risks life, limb, and locomotive on an all-out zany chase to save his love and possibly even rekindle it.
All right, so we're also kind of going on this scale this week, Alex, of Keaton's character going from imaginary hero to accidental hero to unrecognized hero throughout all three of these movies. So this one falls in the category of accidental hero, where he gets thrown unwittingly into this grand adventure. And it is grand, and it is epic, and it is dangerous. This is actually the big climactic train wreck scene at the end of the movie is super impressive, and it's also apparently the most expensive scene ever shot for a silent film, which I completely believe.
Really? Actually, you know what? That makes sense. They built a whole freaking train track, then destroyed it.
A bridge, and with a train on it, and there were tons of extras, running back and forth across the water. It's a big scene. This is a big movie, guys.
Yeah, no, it's huge. I also like how themed this whole movie is. It's like Buster Keaton was like, what would be funny? Trains. Trains would be funny. Let's do a whole movie on trains. Except it's based off of a real story.
Stuff in Sherlock Jr. And now it's like, how many gags can we do on a train? Let's just do all of them.
Commented before about the first half of the 20th century's obsession with trains, and how all movies had like train gags or train scenes. It was a different time. Trains were actually a common, were something everyone was familiar with. We all know what a train is now, but unless you've gone on Amtrak for some reason, you probably haven't traveled on one.
Yeah.
Unless you count subways, but I wouldn't. No. They were relevant to the day, is what we're trying to get to.
Or if your hometown, like ours, currently is home to the National
Train Museum?
Railroad Museum.
Yeah. Whew. Come to Frisco, guys. Go see the train museum.
Come to Frisco for
Except
the trains.
Not right now. Don't travel right now. But, later. Come see the train museum. But yes, we have a very...
Trains are dangerous. Trains are dangerous to be like the thing.
Mm-hmm. You have them riding on the front of a train. You have them riding on the side of the train. The inventiveness of the humor in this movie reminds me more than anything else, of like Jackie Chan's humor, where it's let's get him in a room and see how many things he can turn into a martial gag where he might get hurt, or actually in his case he does get hurt. and it's inventive and it's creative, endlessly creative actually over the course of the movie. I also love that. I mean, we were talking about how enduring his character was in Sherlock Jr. In the general, he is incredibly sympathetic because the world just punches him around at the start of the movie. Also, he's as quirky as a Wes Anderson character. Him holding up the picture of him in the train. He's like, I carry this on me at all times, and it's like a framed picture of him in his train, which is called The General. Is straight out of a Wes Anderson movie. Fight me. It is 100% that. Also, the opening shot of him leaning out the window, push forward, track forward to train track. That's where it's come from. The word general on the engine's also out of a Wes Anderson movie. Just saying.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, his girlfriend breaking up with him, or his fiance, I think, breaking up with him because he doesn't join the army because he's not allowed to, because he is literally an essential worker.
Really
relevant, is one of the fastest ways I've ever felt sorry for a character in my life. Like, she didn't even give him a chance to explain, just dumped his ass.
I never want to see you, until you're in uniform.
I was like, ooh, I would have more sympathy for you if you were on the other side, woman, but you're not, which might have been one of the reasons this was on the South, besides the fact that it was based on a real story.
Events. Yeah.
Quote, true events, yeah.
Which may be one of the earliest examples of creating a fictional story based on real events. And it's so interesting that like such an epic event as a literal train chase, is used so well as a comedy vehicle. I mean, it's action and comedy, which again is what I'm trying to get at, is that the action and the comedy are not mutually exclusive. Like, the comedy doesn't make the action in this movie feel less exciting because it doesn't feel like a setup for a gag. It feels like they are benefiting each other. The anticipation from the action heightens our sense of either, thwarted expectations when it comes to the comedy, or just sheer impressiveness when it comes to the stunts and that kind of stuff. So the action and the comedy feed off of each other more than they detract from each other, which I feel like, there's so many modern films that try to do two things like that, but they don't land solidly on one side or the other, and they don't build on each other in the right way. But this film is like a masterclass in putting those two things together and making them, each part of it better for it.
Yeah, no, they marry each other really well over the course of this film. You feel both thrilled but thrilled with delight at the same time, which is weird because they're definitely in danger of losing their lives over the course of this entire movie, especially during the train chase. But you're like just having the time of your life watching
and
them.
In the story.
Do you know anything about the true events that preluded the story, Jonathan?
The Union stole a Confederate train. I need to look it up again. And they drove it back with the intent to do as much damage to the railroad and to the towns that they passed as possible. And I'm not sure if the train was rescued in the same way or not. Whatever happened. I mean, just I was watching the film and thinking that a train chase is, kind of the most exciting, like a huge, exciting thing that you don't see that much. I mean, not that we use trains that much in movies anyway.
More or less exciting than Snowpiercer?
More exciting than Snowpiercer. Snowpiercer, the train just I think it hit an ice block one time, and that was kind of it as far as the train excitement.
Yeah, no, that train didn't hold up to much, did it?
I mean, all the excitement happened inside the train in Snowpiercer, and that's a, completely different story. But as far as train excitement, this movie's got Snowpiercer way topped. I was thinking a lot more of Unstoppable from 2010, which I think flew way under the radar. It had Chris Pine and I think Denzel Washington. I'm not sure.
Wait, is that like Speed but on a train?
Kind of, without like the dastardly villain plot. It was just this train is out of control and we got to stop it, and they made a 2-hour movie out of that somehow.
Of course they did.
But yeah, I mean, the other thing is that Keaton like worked on keeping the events, as true as possible, with, whatever character development that you got to put in there for, keeping the audience's attention. Like the things that happen in the film, I think are pretty accurate to the way that it actually happened. And he was proud of that. He was really proud of this whole movie because there's so much that went into it. Again, like we were talking about with the last movie, how the cast is very small. Like it's a very contained world. This is a very expansive world. There are so many extras. They've got like,
good gosh, they go everywhere.
Yeah,
the difference in budgets between Sherlock Jr. and the General could not be more different. It's so big.
There's a scene where the train is as the train is kind of just going, we see Buster Keaton doing a bunch of stuff on it, but the landscapes in the background are expansive. I think they shot this in Oregon. There's a story about how like while they were on their way to the shooting location, they would stop in various towns and Keaton and the crew would play baseball with the people in whatever town that was. Apparently he was really good at baseball too. But as the train is going down, there'll be like armies of people on horses. There's like 2 huge armies at the end in the big climactic scene. Like there's so many people. There's got to be 3 or 4 trains at least that they actually use, and the amount of train cars that they just destroy. Apparently the only way to get around in a train in this movie is to break a freaking wall down with a hatchet, because that happens multiple times. So there's just so much logistically that goes into this movie. It's just so impressive. And again, yeah, it's such a contrast from the small scale of Sherlock Jr.
Yeah, no, this one really shows its bones and how much like the crew worked on it, and how much Buster Keaton worked on it too. You can also tell with the scale of this movie why he had a co-director.
Yeah,
there's a lot to do on this movie. There's a lot to coordinate
and choreograph and all that. So I mean,
this one with the through line of the train and kind of progressing along the train track, which is kind of like a good metaphor for a plot in general, but progressing along the train track and having a train chase kind of helps it overcome that idea of being a series of vignettes and move kind of more into the idea of a structured plot. Even the part where we take a break from the train and he goes into the house in the rain, it's kind of like the nice low point in that late half of the second act that you need. You can tell it's only been a few short years since. It's only a 2-year difference between this and Sherlock Jr. But the competence with the plot making and especially the storytelling within the time frame of a feature film has gone up a lot in just that short amount of time.
Yeah, definitely. And as far as like the plot structure, it made me think a lot of Mad Max Fury Road, where it's kind of like a car chase one way across the desert, and then they turn around and they do the car chase back the other way with like various incidents happening along the way. I mean, it's kind of the same thing
Buster
here.
Keaton invented Mad Max?
I mean, I would not. I would not argue with that statement.
You would not say that?
I would not say that. That's for sure. But yeah, I mean, it's so linear. There's like the story is literally on rails. I kept thinking about that. It's like it could almost be some kind of like a fate metaphor if you wanted it to be. But there's so much
having a physical setting mechanic that mirrors your plot moving forward is very nice within the series of a movie. It always answers the question of where are we going next? Well, wherever the road takes us.
Okay, Alex, I kind of want to ask this about the last movie too, but do you have a favorite gag from this movie?
I think the best one, in my opinion, isn't the flashiest. Although I am a fan of the nonsense with the giant, super expensive set. It's the one where he just sits on the I don't know what you would call it. The lever.
Oh yeah,
on the side of the train that connects the
beam.
wheels.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure there's a name for that I just don't know.
Train terminology.
Maybe somebody out there knows. But whenever he just sits on that and is sad, and it carries him away at the start of the movie, and then he repeats it at the very end of the movie, but this time with his lady love, who he's made nice with. I just really like that gag because 1, it's funny. 2, it's creative. 3, it plays on his character of being the sad person that life just kind of carries along through all of this nonsense that's funny for us to watch. And 4, it's used very well in the plot. Like it's at the beginning and it has one meaning, and then it's reused at the end with a very different meaning. He's being carried through life alone and sad at the end, and being carried through life, but with a partner now at the very end of the movie.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. There's so many good ones. I think before I watched this one again, the one that I remembered most vividly for whatever reason is the one where they're at the water spout, which I don't know exactly what those water spouts are for, but they show up in this and Sherlock Jr. And he keeps, trying to cap the water spout, and then it gushes water on the love interest, and then he moves it, and then it gushes water on him, and they keep going back and forward on that. So either that or the cannon bit where he keeps lighting the cannon and almost shooting himself, and then accidentally making it look like he made a good shot at the bad guys, which was super fun.
Yes, that was quite funny. Anything that can be repeated for humor, and we talked about the hat trick before, but anything that can be repeated for humor is always a great idea in when you're doing film comedy, or any kind of comedy for that matter. Callbacks are funny. It makes it feel like you have a in-joke with the audience, even if they just heard it for the first time.
Yeah, right. So we do need to talk about a little bit the fact that even though nowadays this is considered, generally considered his masterpiece, it is almost always included in lists of best movies ever made. And yet it's one of those that we talk about all the time that flopped when it was released and didn't really get its accolades until later on. I was reading some of the contemporary reviews where they're talking about how there are long stretches of time in this movie where all we're seeing are two locomotives chasing each other. And I'm like, that is exciting. What are you talking about?
Is that not the point?
And yeah, they're like,
are you not entertained?
When will Buster Keaton learn that soldiers killing each other is not a place for comedy? And I'm like, but I mean, he gives that part its due, and he doesn't make light of, the war aspects, but he can add the comedy and it still works. It's so interesting that people just didn't get it when it came out. I don't know. Buster Keaton loved it. I mean, they put so much into it, but I mean, it's one of those things that, again, you never know what films are going to stand the test of time right when they're released, because we have come across film after film after film that flopped and is now considered one of the greatest pieces of cinema ever.
Yeah, it happens a lot. Critics can sometimes be mean and nasty, or just not in touch with something that's new or inventive.
Ulterior motives that are very time specific. Yeah, exactly. As much or little as Orson Welles may have deserved those assessments.
We say this as two critics ourselves.
Yeah, we try to stage ourselves as analytics rather than critics.
We try. We're not doing it for any. We're not doing it to get readers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and we try to stay. Although we do make merit judgments, we try to look more at
King Kong 1973 was bad.
Yes, King Kong 1977 will always be our punching bag on this show. But we try to focus on what are the elements that go into making the film good or bad. What elements work even if the film doesn't work, that kind of thing. So that's our justification for not being the bad guys on this side of film history. All right, so let's move on to The Cameraman from 1928. Jason, why don't you set that one up for us?
The Cameraman from 1928. Buster is a sidewalk tintype portrait photographer who, after a parade, develops a crush on Sally, a secretary at a newsreel company. So Buster sets out to become a newsreel cameraman, and despite many mishaps and discouragement, Sally starts to fall for his charm, going on a date with him to the city pool. The date goes seriously wrong after a series of mishaps, with a rival cameraman swooping in and crashing the event. But with a hot tip the next day, Buster is back at it. He's got an unexpected monkey in tow and the drop on a Chinatown gang war right for the filming. Despite his string of bad luck, Buster might save the job and the girl with a little bit of persistence, heart, and some help along the way.
This one is probably the most vignette of the films.
But
and
kind
again,
of purposefully, it almost works.
yeah, no, it's like driven vignettes, which works because it's about a cameraman who, is going around. I think we both had the same thought this week, is that this is like really close to the plot of Nightcrawler, except for it's way less like dark and neo-noir-y, obviously.
Yeah, yeah.
But he's got to go out
and the guy in Nightcrawler wasn't a sociopath, but a good human being.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Just down on his luck. And so he's going out just like finding things to film. One of the shots that just sticks out to me from this movie is Buster Keaton hanging off of the fire truck with his camera, which feels kind of Wes Anderson-y to me. Also, there's a lot of this that feels Wes Anderson-y. But that shot of him where the camera is attached to the fire truck and he's hanging off the back of it, and then the fire truck ends up pulling into the station rather than going to a fire.
Bumps? Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I feel like that's must have been like a really novel kind of a filmmaking. Like it's almost a GoPro shot now, like a throwaway kind of thing. And yet it must have been pretty revolutionary. Like there's so much revolutionary stuff that happens in these movies. Keaton will actually say about things like in Sherlock Jr. with the when they were filming the scene change gag, and like cameramen would just go see the film over and over and over again and just be like, how did they shoot that? Just trying to figure it out so that they could copy him, or just get inspiration for future things, because there's so much that was going on. There's another story about how all the silent comedians would kind of steal each other's gag men, the people who would just write the one-off jokes. They would come in to, fill the story with jokes and that kind of thing. And
comedy writers.
Yeah, right.
We've all seen 30 Rock.
They would they would say, Buster Keaton comes up with all of his own jokes. So we can't steal Buster Keaton himself. So there's not much there. And it's just his so ingenuitous with the way that he plugs in.
Do you mean ingenious?
Ingenious, yeah. His ingenuity shines through in the way that he plugs in his one-off gags and stuff like that. And again, this one is probably kind of falls in the middle of the size range of these two films, but there's still some really, really impressive stuff in here, like the gang war and the monkey steals the show. Though, I mean, let's be real.
It's a well-trained monkey, man.
It is. He seemed like completely knew what was going on. Like he seems directable. I don't know how you do that with a monkey, but
more directable than most human actors I've met.
Right. There's a lot of just kind of like one-off stuff in this movie that I'm trying because the swimming pool scene almost feels like it's not from this movie when I think about that and the gang war at the same time.
I was a little surprised when I saw it in this movie on my rewatch because I remembered that swimming pool scene, but I didn't remember it being in this movie.
Yeah, it feels like a Mr. Hulot's kind of a thing.
Yeah,
kind
it's
of
got
a
that
vibe. But then once it gets into the more actiony stuff at the end, like this one almost mixes genres, as much as like the other ones kind of use genre. This one kind of just plays on a bunch of various genres, where they have kind of like a vacation scene, they have like the thwarted romance scene, they have the battle scene, and it all goes into like Buster Keaton being this kind of well-rounded filmmaker, like within the story, which works really well. But it does make it feel like, oh my gosh, these all kind of go together. Like it feels, I don't want to say disjointed, but you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, it takes a lot of turns. It's a little disconnected compared, especially coming off of The General, which has that very straight through line, literally like track laid out for it. It does feel more disjointed, which isn't completely out of the blue for a lot of comedy movies. That's not like something I would say is totally random. But it's just, especially compared to what we've seen before from some of his other movies, it is a little surprising.
Yeah. And we're definitely, looking at all of these movies with modern film sensibilities, modern genre expectations, and that kind of thing, which don't always apply in the same way. And one thing that I was thinking about during this movie, which I just looked it up and I realized that the movie came out the next year, but I feel like this would be a good double feature with Man with a Movie Camera by Dziga Vertov, who's a famous Soviet filmmaker who made Man with Movie Camera, which is documentary, like experimental documentary, but it's a similar kind of thing where he makes this film about how film kind of encompasses all of life. And that's kind of what you get here when you have all of these different elements going into it. It's just showing the breadth of what film and cinema is, encompassing the even into kind of the news realm. And so that breadth of comedy and that breadth of scene and tone and all that kind of stuff kind of works for that reason, I think.
Yeah, no, I kind of like the Nightcrawler aspect of this movie. Yeah.
It's really interesting, and I didn't know it went back this far.
I mean, it makes sense. Somebody had to go get all that newsreel footage. Yeah. And I like how it's contrasted at the beginning with all these heroic people out in the field going into putting themselves in danger to get the news, to bring it back to us poor humble people.
With what I assume is actual like World War I footage in one of the first shots where they have the cameraman green screened over the war footage and that kind of thing and showing how heroic cameramen are. And then we see Buster Keaton with his tintype, which
that was such a great introduction. It was so funny. It was like, here's all these noble people, and then here's this guy with the tintype.
Yeah.
This is who we're going to tell our story about.
And just to preface, tintype is literally
it's like really early Polaroid.
Yeah, it's a really early camera, still camera method where you would expose a piece of film that's within a little, essentially a can. Like you can literally do it with a soup can. There's a piece of film in there that when it's exposed to light, it will imprint the light onto the film itself and in a positive format, because normally you expose it in a negative and then you've got to take it and develop it and, reverse all the colors and it turns positive. All that technical stuff that digital photographers and cinematographers don't have to deal with anymore. But yeah, it's the cheapest way to make a photo, probably that will ever be invented. It's literally just a piece of film and a can and a hole. And so this is our hero. He's over here trying to sell photos taken through a can
hole, and he falls ridiculously in love with a woman he's seen for 5 seconds,
as you do,
which is ridiculous. And he's like pressed up against her in the crowd, which is a little creepy, but can't be excused, considering that's as creepy as the whole thing gets, and the rest is very respectful and endearing. But yes, he's just so juxtaposed compared to everybody else in the realm, in the world of this film, who's successful by comparison. That you can't help.
We have
you have that underdog thing going for him again.
Yeah, right. Because we have the big MGM cameraman, blah blah blah. Again, this was made after he signed with MGM, so he's got to compete against the studio cameraman. It's almost like a metaphor for Buster Keaton before he was in the studio. Ironically, the first film that came out after he was signed with the studio. But then eventually, like, it's a really classic kind of a love story arc where, you know, he gets misunderstood. The other guy looks like the hero, and then
the other guy kind of ends up
accidentally
taking advantage of the situation to sabotage Buster Keaton.
Yeah,
not directly.
right.
He didn't interfere with the camera, but he did continue to twist the story to his advantage. Thereby
and then the
creating a
truth
situation.
comes out kind of unwittingly because the monkey saves the day. The monkey is the best.
Monkey's
the monkey's
king.
the best.
We all need a good monkey.
We didn't even bring up the fact that there was a freaking bear in The General.
Oh yeah, there was, wasn't there? Lots of animals in silent film.
They use a lot of wild animals in silent film. This is crazy. But yeah, so the monkey ends up. The monkey is like the first documentary filmmaker in this film. I think the monkey invents documentary filmmaking in this movie.
That would make sense.
But yeah, okay. So we should also talk about the gang war, which we've kind of been hinting at. But that is got to be the most impressive part of this whole movie. Like, there's so much choreography that goes into that, and so much of the story hinges on it too, where there's these two rival gangs, and Buster Keaton gets the tip off that they're going to start fighting, and then he goes there, and then, you know, it's literally like John Ford at the Battle of Midway, where he just ends up in the middle of this battle, and he's just turning the camera around and trying to catch whatever's happening, and then he eventually ends up like in the middle of the fight, and then he ends up in the ringleader's headquarters, and is like right there when the whole thing comes to a head, and he ends up with a monkey out of it. The monkey
that happened right beforehand, right? Like it was an organ grinder's monkey
in the middle. Oh yeah, no, you're right. That happened right before. But the monkey becomes complicit in the gang war because he shoots a machine gun, and who knows how many casualties were at the hands of this.
Oh my
monkey.
gosh, the monkey murders people.
It's
Like,
this is a
the
dark
monkey
movie,
casually
man.
murders people in this movie,
And you laugh about it.
and you laugh about it.
That's
Man,
how
you
good
really have
Buster
to do
Keaton
some
is.
soul searching after watching that. And then, of course, there's I like the ending of this movie because it is very similar to how the plot is resolved in Sherlock Jr. In that the woman kind of saves the day. But he's won the movie, so to speak. He's completed his arc and won the movie when he saves the woman from drowning.
Yeah, because he
But
knows
he doesn't think so.
he's been defamed, and he lets it go, and he goes to live his life. And then she realizes the mistake that she's made, and then she comes back. But it's really dramatic structure by the end. Like, for all the twists and turns that it takes, like, you're super invested in these two characters, and then by the time he's back to his tintype and she comes and she's like, I've made a mistake, you're just like so thrilled for them.
Yeah, no, it's a very endearing end. I also love that the monkey captures the last bit of footage.
Yeah.
Which brings me to a question, Jonathan. Who is the title referring to? Is it referring to Keaton or is it referring to the monkey?
That's a good question. I'm going to go with Keaton.
I'm going to go with the monkey.
All right. Leave us a comment below. Tell us, who do you think the cameraman is referring to?
Let us know. Who do you think it is? All right. Shall we go to overall notes?
Yeah, let's talk about overall, because, I mean, a lot of this is just, there's so many like specific gags that you can just pull out of each of these. The stories are really well crafted and all of that, but the way that he's able to weave in, like, the ideas for each individual gag are so good. And sometimes they're just like, they're either dangerous or they're straight up, you know, embarrassing when you think about them. Like, I still can't get over how weird the whole swimming pool scene is, where
it's very strange.
We spend 5 minutes watching him change in a little tiny changing room with a dude
with a much bigger dude, which is the gag, who's also an asshole.
Which is a one take. It goes on for so long. I don't know how long it is, but it probably feels longer than it is.
Yeah.
And then So he comes out with the swimsuit that's way too big for him, and then he goes swimming and loses it, and then he steals the clothes off an old lady later just to get out of it. And like, it's funny when you watch it, but when you think about it, you're like, what is happening here?
Yeah, no, it's some interesting gags. It almost feels like gags that he couldn't fit into some other project, and so they went here.
Yeah. Or it may be a gag that someone else at the studio thought was funny, and this is kind of like the beginning of that, but that's not verified or anything. That's just my speculations. But yeah, another thing that we should talk about that we haven't hit on too much throughout these films is that for silent films, Keaton was really insistent on keeping the title cards to a minimum. He thought, especially for the type of comedy that he did, as much communication should happen visually as possible. And so I think his average title card usage was, I saw a statistic somewhere, but it's less than half of what the general silent film average was, because in the medium that he was using, once you get into films where you can talk and that kind of thing, you can't ride the line between a book and a movie by just throwing in 500 title cards as you go through and people are trying to communicate. Like, he's using the gags and he's using his expression and the blocking and all that stuff to convey everything that you need to know. And sometimes you can even, based on the situation, someone will mouth something and you can tell exactly what they're saying. So you don't even need to use the title card in that situation. And so he's using all of these physical visual gags, not only for entertainment, but also for communication. And he was really good at it.
Yeah, no, that's one of the best. That's often a mark of really good silent films, when you don't need to rely on people spelling it out. It's the silent film version of show, don't tell. You want to be engaged in the on-screen story happening through the live action events as much as possible. And every time you pause to go to an intertitle, you're technically taking a break. It's like stopping in the middle of a paragraph to read a footnote. It's a little disjointing. It's a little disconcerting. And it's one of the reasons why the mechanics, like looking at the rule book in Sherlock Jr. is much less jarring than going to a full-blown intertitle.
Because it's diegetic, technically.
Yeah. He only goes to titles when he absolutely needs it, or like when the specific words used by a person matter a lot. When he gets refused for the service in the general and then he gets rejected by his fiance. Those words are the specific words she says are very important because they play into how he redeems himself later on, and it's hard to communicate that complicated of a sentence anyway other than that specific intertitle.
Yeah, and just to kind of spell it out, in that instance, she says, "I don't want to see you again until you're in uniform." And the irony is that the next time she sees him, he's in the Union uniform undercover. And so it's like, technically he is, but also it's kind of not what she was expecting. And so the use of the words goes into, paying off a gag that happens later on. Even if it's not like a straight up gag, it's a situational irony that you wouldn't have been able to get across if she had been pantomiming it or something like that.
Yeah. It was one of the necessary usages. It's interesting. I went through that book, Who the Hell Made It? I think that's the one it is. He uses a different curse word in each of his books, Bogdanovich, but I think that's Who the Hell Made It. And all of the directors who worked during the silent film, they all bring up trying to reduce intertitle usage to a minimum because it's so jarring. And it's one of those things that I think doesn't help for people trying to get into silent film who haven't been there before. Having to stop and read the movie isn't necessarily great. But there are some really good examples out there of its usage. And it can be good when done well. And Buster Keaton is one of those instances of it doesn't have to be too hard. Chaplin's pretty good at it as well. And anything directed by... Oh, gosh. I'm blanking on his name. German, made a lot of really good movies.
Fritz Lang?
Fritz Lang. Fritz Lang did a lot of really good work with intertitles. He tried to keep his to a minimum. I think there's almost none in M, which is
M was technically sound. It was the one that was on that line because
yes, that's right.
Peter Lorre has a monologue at the end, so that was a mostly sound film, I think.
Yes, yeah, that's right. It just kind of mostly feels like a silent film for a lot of it.
It was right on the edge there.
I gotcha. Yes, but we did watch some of his older stuff, some of his German fairy tale stuff, and those as well. He does keep the intertitles to a minimum, and they are quite good.
And the German expressionists were so good at conveying information visually that they almost didn't need it.
That's what the term expressionist means.
Yeah.
Is to convey meaning through visuals.
To make a specific connection, I was thinking about Fritz Lang during Sherlock Jr. because there's the moment where when the dream sequence starts, Buster Keaton is asleep at the projector, and a kind of, what we think of is most commonly used now as like a spirit leaving the body kind of effect, where he stands up, but he's still sitting there. And it reminded me of one of the other early examples of that kind of thing was in the Testament of Dr. Mabuse, where there's like this split between the evil version of Dr. Mabuse and the other version, and it's really jarring and like creepy in that film. The duality of man
haunts our existence during this lifetime.
Thank you, Fritz. But that use was really interesting just to be seen in like a really lighthearted context, because you almost only see that. You still do see that effect today, but it's almost always has to do with like death or something much more tragic and or suspenseful.
Death is the one truth that we all come to know as mortal men.
You're getting a little bit into Werner Herzog, but I'll take
That's really what I was channeling more of. Yeah.
Okay.
It was just Germans,
Yeah. So I do think we have to give like an honorable mention this week to Steamboat Bill Jr., which is like
it's hilarious.
Right outside of being on this list. We're just, based on our constraints for the podcast, we picked the three, but Steamboat Bill Jr. has some of the most classic Keaton gags in it. For example, the house falling on him, and he stands in the little tiny window, which is just insane, because that house was literally 2 tons, that piece that fell on him, and he had like 2 feet of range that he could have stood in, and then the wind stuff that I don't even know how they pulled off some of the wind stuff, and there's so much good stuff in Steamboat Bill Jr. And again, like we kind of tried to hit home last week when setting up this episode, all of these are available online, and so if you're interested in doing comedy filmmaking, if you're interested in the origins of filmmaking, if you're interested in modern comedy, go look up these movies. They are all available for free online. I will even be putting links to them in the blog post for this episode. But there's so much that can be learned, and more than just learning, like they're just enjoyable. Like every time I watch a silent film, I'm amazed because there's like this in general population. I feel like there's a stigma against, old films where people be like, I don't watch black and white films. And yet when you watch them, you realize a lot of times there's more creativity in those old films than in anything that's coming out these days. And it's so refreshing. It can be so refreshing to watch films that are over 100 years old. So I highly recommend watching all 3/4 of these movies, and just kind of getting your own enjoyment and fulfillment out of them beyond what we've said. 'Cause we can state the obvious, but it's the thrill of actually watching it that really counts.
I mean, we're basically the obviouslings.
Yeah, there's that. We watch it so that you can watch it later.
I mean, I would recommend these films for anybody who wants to do any sort of comedic work. I don't just mean stand-up comedians, but anybody who wants to be funny in whatever they do, whatever creative pursuit you do. Or even if you just want to be funnier in a day-to-day setting. Comedy and humor is one of those things that's hard to define. You can't really define it, but you can improve your ability at it through
His tastes
comprehension
and
gained through
sensibilities are
experience.
so broad too.
Yeah. You have to see, like, it's hard to say what makes something funny. There's a lot of different theories on it, but none of them are 100% true. So it often helps best to improve yourself through watching stuff that's funny and watching stuff on a broad context that's funny to learn different ways to make people laugh. So
Bringing it back to the Sherlock Jr. meta commentary.
yeah, so if you genuinely want to learn how to be funny, watch Buster Keaton, watch Charlie Chaplin, watch Harold Lloyd, then go into like the comedy duos of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, watch the SNL wave of the 70s. Don't just watch SNL, because that's what's happened to SNL. Sorry,
right.
did I just throw a hot take out there? I think I did. That's what's happened to SNL. SNL has become a parody of SNL. Anyway,
Probably literally. Have they done a joke about themselves?
they probably do. I also don't know if they're all coked up as much as they were in the early days.
That's true. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a sense that if you're only influenced by the things that are, coming out contemporarily, then everything will just start to feel stale and the same, which it has.
Yeah.
So watch the old stuff.
Yeah, be broad. Be broad in your reading and your studying.
All right. Well, we are sticking with the old stuff next time on the podcast. Alex, why don't you let us know what we will be talking about when we meet here again?
Well, I'm very excited, Jonathan, to talk about one Dorothy Arzner next week on the podcast.
One of almost a two-hander kind of an episode thing that we're going to be doing back to back with some more
Arzner and then another
classic
female director. Yeah. They
some
kind
of
of
the
lead
early
into each
female
other in a
directors.
very nice way.
Yeah.
So Dorothy Arzner, if you didn't know, is the only female director working in Hollywood during the 30s and the early 40s. There were many female directors during the silent era, but by the time sound came along and the DGA was formed, that wasn't really the case. So Dorothy Arzner was the first female director in the DGA, and the difference in her filmmaking shows. You can tell in how she makes her films. She made several films over the course of her career, and eventually retired to make a bunch of Pepsi commercials or for just gobs of money, and then became a professor at UCLA, where she taught one Francis Ford Coppola, and is often cited as one of his big influences. So
interesting.
We're going to be talking about, he just a couple of years ago, I think he dedicated a new building on the Paramount lot. I think, don't hold me to that, on the Paramount lot to her, because she did a lot of her work there. So yeah, big influence on him, both her films and her teaching. And she's a very interesting person for a lot of reasons. She was one of the first, not openly, that's the wrong word for Hollywood at the time, but she was very gay, and that shows in her movies as well. And she just has some interesting movies as well. And we're going to get to see some interesting actresses in there. We'll get to see a fairly young Lucille Ball back when she played in all B movies, and she plays the heavy in Dance Girl Dance, which is interesting to see her as like the bad guy. But anyway, the three films we're specifically going to be talking about are Get Your Man from 1927, which has Claire Bow in it. Big star from the late 20s. Then Merrily We Go to Hell from 1932. And then finally Dance Girl Dance from 1940, which is her second to last movie. She made a war hero story after that. Had something like Courage in the title. But that is the breadth of her movies that we're going to be covering next week on the podcast. Should be an interesting look. It's interesting how different the social interactions feel in her movies compared to other movies of the same time. And that's kind of what drew me to that movie in the first place. And I'm very excited to be talking about it next week on the show.
I'm also really interested to watch the first two films, I think, are pre-code. And
they are, yes.
Usually it's not really an issue when we're talking about comedies. Like Buster Keaton, because those don't usually have that much kind of pushing the envelope type stuff. But with these dramas, I'm really interested to see how that plays out.
There's some dramatic endings. There's also there's some heavy stuff in there. There's also some very Hollywood endings. I think Merrily We Go to Hell specifically is built, and we'll talk about this more next week, but it's specifically built so that you can clearly delineate where Barsner wanted the movie to end, and then when the Hollywood ending happens in the last 10 seconds of the movie, so it's technically sellable, but you all know what should have happened. Yeah,
it's like
it should not have
she
been.
Snuck in a director's cut ending.
Essentially, yes. You know what the ending's supposed to be. It's not supposed to end happily. It's called Merrily We Go to Hell. It's going to be bad. So yeah,
all right.
Yeah,
I'm
it should
excited.
be a very fascinating week. Anyway, anything else to talk about, Jonathan?
Yeah. So as we plugged a little bit throughout the episode, we do have a Patreon account. So if you would like to support the show, you can do that. For $2 a month, you get to be part of our online community. You get to see our notes as we write them while we're watching the movies. We have a Discord where you can chat with other patrons about movies that we talk about the show, movies that we don't talk about the show. Sometimes we do Netflix parties. We live record our episodes so you can hear all of our goofs and things that don't make it into the edited show. And then at the $5 tier, you get the bonus podcast, which is an extra content that comes out on the weeks that we don't release our main show episodes. And the last episode of that, we talked about the recently released Emma, which was hilarious. And we talked about, the new phenomenon.
I feel the draft.
There's always a draft. And there's always a screen to protect you from that draft.
And servants to carry the screen.
And servants, so many servants. But we talked about just kind of this new thing that we're seeing with films being released early to digital streaming and where that might go and stuff like that. So if you
has that taken some turns since we've released that podcast?
Oh, really? I don't know that I'm in the loop on that. So
we'll talk about AMC's boycott.
Not yet, but that'll be a teaser for our bonus podcast, which we're about to record. So if you would like to hear more on that conversation, go subscribe on the Patreon.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And I'm at the Blue Jay 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
How much time do you think about trains? How much time do you dedicate to that in a day? What would you say, 1% of it? 10%? 20%?
No, probably higher than you'd think based on how often I have to stop and compete with you again on Ticket to Ride.
That's true. Actually, I almost forgot about that. There is a lot of Ticket to Ride going on. In fact, there is a game coming to a head right now. We are getting very close. Risky moves are being made.
I know. I think I've been playing this map wrong too.
But that's no idea how the stocks work. I have no clue.
I think I just figured it out, and I think we have to redo this one.
Yeah, I think I maybe know how it works now, but not entirely.
Yeah.